I've come to the sad conclusion that I think that we are being pandemic groomed. And I took some time to think about this topic because it was registering to me before this, but there was a news report today about Ebola. Another outbreak of Ebola is occurring. Before this, we had Nipah virus in India. Prior to that, we had bird flu. Just recently, we've had the hantavirus, which is still ongoing. And of course, there is another cruise ship that has an outbreak of norovirus. Interestingly, nowhere in this is COVID. And everyone is trying to move on from COVID, even though COVID is not trying to move on from anyone else. So we have a problem here. And the longer I think about it, the more worrying it gets. Because what we seem to be having here is that you are being prepared for a pandemic. Now, the reality is that pandemics don't come about very often. And the last one before COVID was in 1918, almost exactly just over 100 years before. So there is no good reason for pandemics to come around this frequently. Granted, there are more people, there's more travel, but there are a few characteristics about a pandemic that you really need to understand in order to get your head around it. Now, before we get into that, I just wanted to break to you the latest news that is coming out of the WHO, and this is what is happening here. Africa CDC calls an urgent regional coordination meeting following Ebola virus disease outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is the 15th of May 2026, today. And they are still trying to work out which exactly virus it is, whether it's a non Zaire Ebola virus, because the Zaire variant is the most severe. Latest update, 246 suspected cases and 65 deaths. Now, what's interesting with this is that this didn't happen today. This clearly has been going on in the background, but the cases have been building and it's now being discussed at this point. Clearly, it means that something has happened that made them say, we need to probably do a news release. But as I said, this is on the back of the fact that you have had an outbreak with regards to hantavirus, which is still ongoing. First point that I think is critical with regards to Ebola, just so that you have a few facts. I don't expect this to become a pandemic, but here are some details about it. It is a viral infection and it can be severe, and it spreads through direct contact with body fluids. When people spread it, they are usually sick. And so the risk is very high to healthcare workers and those who are caring for them. And even after death, they can pass it on. And if you get early intervention, it can save lives. So at the moment, this is happening in Africa, and depending on where in Africa, will determine the level of medical care. And so you can imagine if this happened elsewhere, there should be in a first world country less risk of mortality. Fever, vomiting and diarrhea, headache, bleeding can occur, and it is an emergency. And again, it spreads through close contacts. This is very important because Ebola, because of these characteristics, especially the fact that people who usually spread it are sick, makes it very unlikely to be a pandemic. And this is an important point, and it's something that people don't quite get. What really does it take to make a pandemic? And so I've put together a template of what are the main things that would determine what would cause a pandemic. When we look carefully at this, what we find are one, it needs to infect humans very efficiently. Now, hantavirus, say for instance, infects rats. That's the host. And it can infect humans, but not efficiently. So I wouldn't expect hantavirus or Nipah virus to become pandemics. They could infect people who are in the environment where it's around. It needs to spread easily between people. None of the viruses, except potentially flu, could do that. This is critical. It needs to transmit before the control measures, because even if a virus is spreading, if you quarantine the people, you can control the spread. You can't do that with COVID. As you remember, even when they did lockdowns, it wasn't easy to control that spread. Critically, you need low immunity in the population, and you need high travel networks. Additionally, respiratory spread is most likely going to be the root. People who have transmission before they get symptoms. This was very important with COVID. Very high viral shedding, mild illness early. People just think they have a little viral infection, but they're spreading it. And critically, no rapid vaccine or treatment response. That was what happened early in the pandemic. So the pandemics are driven more by transmission, not about necessarily the severity of the disease. Because if the virus is very lethal, it will kill people before they have a chance to spread it. Now, why am I talking about this? And why am I mentioning this concept of pandemic grooming? Because we have been seeing a lot of cases. Ebola, as I just spoke about, Nipah, bird flu, norovirus, hantavirus, it just seems to be going on and on. You are getting prepared for the fact that there may be another pandemic coming. Now, how would they know? Well, this is where you have to start to think. Now, I spoke with a journalist who was challenging during the pandemic period, and he said something very important. He said, based on his observation, the reason that so many people got taken down paths that they would look back now and say, how did I let that happen? Is because good people didn't ask enough hard questions. They were too trusting. And that may sound strange. Why shouldn't you trust those who have been given the responsibility to protect you? It's not that you don't trust, but you need to ask them hard questions. If they get something wrong, they need to explain why and justify whether or not the next thing they say is right. If you don't do things like that, you are likely to be led down a road that is not good for anybody. Because remarkably, when I look back at the pandemic, the people who seemed to be trying to do the right thing, making sure they followed all the instructions, were in fact weaponizing the power that politicians and systems were looking for. And I guarantee you, they don't want to let it go. And this is part of the reason why I think that we are in very dangerous waters. Now, in order to understand why I'm taking that position, I'm going to have to take you back historically to a very important discussion. So in 2022, I had a conversation, and I've put the link in the description. This is almost 4 years ago. It included Dr. Shetty, Professor Uhal, myself, and Professor Ambati. This gentleman, a doctor and a scientist, was the individual who found the Furin cleavage site on the virus. Now, a lot of people don't even know about this Furin cleavage site. I keep on talking about it. It annoys scientists because those who are following the narrative will tell you that this can happen in nature. The problem is that it has never happened in nature for human coronavirus. It has happened in other animal viruses, and we can't seem to find the origin of this virus that came from the wet market. Let me tell you something that you don't know. You have to be looking. You remember when Lab Leak was killed and the idea of it was debunked as just misinformation? One person in India refused to give in and continued to research until he found evidence of the papers that were working on coronaviruses in the specific lab in question. This was the reason why the lab leak then couldn't be debunked, because there was clear evidence that the virus was, or a similar virus, was being worked on in a lab in the proximity to where it happened. One person asking hard questions and not giving in made the difference. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because you have to understand where you are in this cycle. And so I did an exercise with AI, and I put in front of it the facts, gave it the papers, made it look at the assessments, and here is what it came up with based on everything it saw. Possible origins of SARS-CoV-2, likelihood assessment, natural spillover is a moderate risk. So viruses in animals, yep, they can potentially spill to humans, say for instance in a wet market, but the virus wouldn't just appear in the wet market. It would have come from the wild, so it should have infected the person who got the bat, who should have infected his family and anybody on the transport that made him get to the market. And so you should have a trajectory of illness. We didn't see that. This is part of the reason why it's only moderate. The highest likelihood, moderate to moderately high, was a lab accident. That, a naturally occurring bat virus, which was being studied in a lab, accidentally got out. That makes perfect sense. It thinks a deliberate release was very low. An engineered modification with a leak, it thinks is a low to moderate probability. And just a lab accident, moderate. So interestingly, it thinks a natural accident with a natural virus, a lab accident, was the highest probability for what caused the pandemic. Good people haven't asked enough questions. They have just said, you know what? We trust everyone who tells us this is natural zoonotic spillover. Now, why am I mentioning this? And this is why I'm saying it's wise to listen to that interview from November of 2022. I have reposted it on my Substack, because when you reflect carefully on the Furin Cleavage site, and I do have an image so that I've made an image so that people would understand what this Furin Cleavage site is and why it's relevant. And this is what it is. It's a very small sequence of amino acids, and it's right at the joint between the two parts of the spike protein. So multiple spikes on the surface of the virus. This is just one spike protein. This is the S1 part. This is the S2 part. The Furin Cleavage site is right at the middle, where it splits it, so that when the virus binds, where the spike protein binds from the virus to a cell, the Furin Cleavage site will assist in priming and getting the virus into the cell. It can be argued that without this Furin Cleavage site, it would have been very difficult for SARS-CoV-2 to become a pandemic. The reason I've mentioned this is that coincidentally, I mean, this is just purely coincidental, the same sequence was patented a number of years before. Now, we don't know if there is any connection. It could be purely incidental, and there is no challenge to who has the patent. We're not saying that who has the patent was involved, but it is quite a coincidence. It would be like seeing a fingerprint on a knife with the blood stain. And when you find the fingerprint for the person, they say, I don't know how my fingerprint got there. A detective, I am sure, wouldn't accept that as an explanation. And a good thinking public shouldn't either. And this is the point I'm making. If you hadn't been asking hard questions, if this potentially was something that was relevant, and this is the point that I'm making, because you just have to go back to history to realize that there were some pretty strange people historically in the world who did some pretty terrible things. Is it possible that people like that still exist today? Is it possible that people could seek to cause harm to populations across the world? I mean, I would hope that everybody is good and that their intention is all for the best. But there are people who don't have good intentions. We have a lot of fodder going around here. And here's the warning. None of these really, except maybe bird flu. And there's a problem for bird flu, actually. Let me tell you what the problem is going to be. You can't have a pandemic when you already have an epidemic. And even though people don't want to acknowledge it, COVID is still circulating avidly, and there are almost no symptoms these days. Very minor symptoms until people get complications. And what that means is that it's not as easy to get a viral co-infection. So if one virus has infected, then another virus coming behind it, the interferon may have kicked in, so it makes it harder. So with COVID circulating, it makes it even more difficult for another pandemic to occur. But here is the point that I realized, and this is why I'm talking about it. I came across some information recently that I don't talk about publicly that made me realize if there is any intention of harm, what is going to come next is going to be horrific. That's the worry. Anybody who thinks that you would be able to approach it in the same way of COVID, no chance. I am worried that if my concern is correct, and there are individuals, organizations, whatever you want to call it, who have intentions that could cause harm, they would use techniques that are beyond our capability to easily get over. And I have specifically looked at something that I think, oh my goodness, this is why I said I don't talk about it. I just think if this was what happened, we are in trouble. And what we need more than ever is a determination that we cannot ever allow this kind of thing to occur and questions not be asked. So your job at the moment is quite simple. And I think that it is a useful exercise for everyone here to reflect on this conversation that happened with regards to the scientists who found the Furin cleavage site. The link is in the description. It's free to watch. I've made an article around it to help. And as I said, I've put some images in. I've put the paper that they published. And critically, what I found very interesting was how he felt and how he approached what was going on. Because at the time when he saw it, he was very afraid. And it took some time for him to actually bring people in to discuss it. And it's fascinating to see, because what it shows is that when you do have scientists who are willing to take the steps to do the research, to make the challenge, they do a service for everyone in the world. The responsibility is for all of us to be very careful, to ask hard questions. If there's one thing you learn now, don't just take someone's word for it. Force them to corroborate why. Let them make all the scientific explanations. If there are other causes, force them to have to explain why and consider it. Make them look at every hole. Every rabbit hole needs to be investigated. The light needs to be shone every single place. Anyone who is not doing that is not doing you a service. And you must be aware and ask the hard questions. So, as I said, final point, look in the description and just remember, I think we're being groomed. This is where it is. This is the reality of what we're facing. It is virus after virus after virus. One thing possibly in the near future will come through, and it may be so horrific, and you will be told, you will be told you could have seen the evidence that something was going to happen naturally because all of these things were happening. And at that point, you will have no answer and no options. Thank you very much for listening. These are just my thoughts. You don't have to take them for anything, but as I said, do the responsible thing, look at the science, reflect on it, and please ask hard questions. Have a great evening.